The moonlight in men's eyes. Harold watched El Centro shrinking in the rear-view mirror. A cluster of flashing neon and a ring of incandescent gold. The shining mound of civilization morphed slowly to a thin strip of light across the black desert landscape. Ahead he saw only the halo of his high beams on the road and the minute taillights of cars far ahead. He'd had to sell the CD player, so the engine's growling refrain formed a monotonous soundtrack over which Mandy's voice occasionally broke. She wanted to talk. She always wanted to talk. Usually about matters Harold assumed were forgone and concluded. "Why are you always ignoring me?" she complained, in the wounded voice that always stirred his demons. "We've been riding for hours in this goddamn heat, Harold, and you can't even talk?" Harold cranked down his window, and a fist of hot air pummeled her words into nothing. He inhaled the flat breath of the desert. It was heavy with the sense of man's presence. Cauliflower, cow shit, insecticide. But none of them could eclipse the primordial aroma of this place. The first dirt. "So that's it," Mandy yelled over the wind. "That's all you got to say? Nothing?" Harold turned his attention to the rearview mirror. The moon was rising behind them, washing the desert in a faint silver glow. "Do you still love me?" Somehow her whisper pierced the braying wind. He couldn't ignore this one. "Of course, damn it, Mandy," he moaned. "Just let a man think once in a while, will you?" "You've been thinking for hours, Harold. Ain't you figured out whatever the hell it is yet?" He rolled up the window. "Okay then," he said. "What you want to talk about?" "You didn't answer my question." "Oh, come on, babe," Harold sighed. "You know you're my jewel." He was certain it had once been true, when he'd first seen her erupt from the back door of Randy's tavern, adjusting the straps on her dress, laughing at the drunk that had followed her out and then fell face first to the ground. He had immediately known that whatever impulse had made him look twice at her would grow into something he could not control. When she'd looked back, the weight of her lingering gaze had triggered something inside of him, something from a secret place where his heart had never wandered. But that was long before the monotony of married life had worn through the fabric of their love, long before he would awaken to see something other than his jewel laying beside him and silently wonder what had happened to their lives. A weathered sign appeared ahead. Sandwiches, beer. "I need a damn drink," Harold said, before she had a chance to start complaining about something else. He rolled off the road and into the stark light of the mini-mart. He killed the engine, and they sat in a cricket-coated silence. "What you want?" he said. She didn't reply. He returned her silence for a moment, before climbing out of the car and retreating into the air-conditioned mini-mart. A long-haired relic stood up from whatever he'd been doing behind the counter. Harold didn't want to know what that was. "Hey now," the man said. Harold nodded a response and headed for the back of the store. Chilled racks of bottles shone amber and gold behind the glass doors. The sight provoked a memory of a better time, an image of her, laughing and shaking a sweating bottle, thumb pressed against its tiny mouth. She'd released her thumb, and the foam had spat and coated him. He'd jumped up and tackled her as she tried to flee, laughing as he took her down onto the sand, where he lost himself in the feel and the smell of her. "Well, that shit's over," Harold muttered. His memories dissipated into the Freon mist as he opened the door. "Oldie," the man behind the counter said, nodding at Harold's canary yellow Camaro. Harold grunted a response and passed him a 20. You from Phoenix, eh? Harold shot the man a quick, skeptical look as he tilled the money and made change. Aged desert leather for skin, long strands of graying hair fallen over tattooed shoulders on arms too big for his uniform. He nodded a hesitant admission. Yeah, I can usually tell, the man said, squaring his shoulders as if he'd just scored a point in some game Harold didn't know they were playing. This was probably how the old-timer passed the night, he figured, guessing where people were coming from or headed to. Running or chasing? The man asked, as Harold pocketed the change. Harold didn't quite get this one. He raised a questioning brow. Everybody's running or chasing, the man said. Got a little pot of gold around the corner, or maybe a little devil behind? I bet you're doing a little of both. Harold eyed the man's name tag. You must get pretty bored out here, eh, Gus? He said. Gus shrugged the question off and leaned on the counter. He glanced around the empty store, as if he was worried that someone else might overhear what he was about to say. The absurdity of this caution made Harold curious enough to listen. Gotta be careful out there in the full moon, Gus said. He gestured to the darkness that lay beyond the parking lot. Them Indians that used to live out there, they believe some weird shit about the moonlight. Weird shit, Harold repeated. Yeah, spirits, demons, shit like that. Gus stood and crossed his arms. I used to laugh it off, but a year back or so there was this fella came rushing into the store acting all crazy. Says he came out from Mesa with his girl, right? They was headed for L.A., just like you two, I suppose. Gus paused, as if waiting for confirmation. Harold didn't bite. Well, anyways, Gus continued, he says he stopped to take a leak near Bucktull Canyon, just past Blythe. Yeah, you know that place? Harold shook his head. Well, it's right off the freeway. You'll pass it in a bit. So anyway, he's taking a piss when he hears this howl, like a coyote, But he don't think nothing of it. He just finishes his business. But when he's headed back to the car, he sees something moving in the moonlight. Said it looked like a wolf, but he wasn't sure because it dashed across the desert so damn fast he couldn't get a fix on it. So man, he's scared now. He lets out running, screaming for his girl to lock the door, but... Gus paused then, and did that slow scan of the store again. Harold didn't know why he wasn't headed for the car. He convinced himself that he was just being amused by the ramblings of an old fool, that his feeling of unease was just anxiousness to be on his way. Gus finally continued. But when he gets back to the car, he finds his girl all cut up and bleeding like... The man flexed his fingers as if he was trying to pull the words out of the air, but they were obviously not coming. Well, something just fucked her up, he said finally. The guy didn't see it happen, didn't hear so much as a scream. Gus squared his shoulders again and raised his brows as if to say, how'd you like that one? Harold clucked his tongue. Well, that's a real winner, he said, and started for the door. Hey, I seen her, Gus yelled, all covered in blood, sitting right where your pretty wife is right now. Yep. Harold couldn't hold his laughter. And what's your boss think about you getting drunk on the job, old-timer? Gus shook his head in disappointment. He pinched his chin for a pensive moment and seemed about to respond when his eyes suddenly fixed on a point over Harold's shoulder. Oh, shit! He screamed, gesturing wildly at something behind Harold. Harold turned quickly and stepped back from the glass door. His hand rose automatically to ward off whatever might be there. But he saw only a reflection in the glass. His reflection, wide-eyed and sweaty, fists cocked and ready to strike. He turned slowly to see Gus croaking a rusty laugh. You son of a bitch, Harold muttered. He raised a solitary finger at Gus, who only cackled harder. Yeah, I get bored sometimes, partner. Gus explained when his wheezing laughter had subsided. So I'm always happy for a chance to chat with a customer. Harold tucked his finger away and was turning to leave when he noticed the wooden stock sticking up from a harness behind the register. His gaze wandered from the harness to Gus and back. "Bad neighborhood?" he said. Gus followed Harold's gaze to the shotgun. He smiled and winked. "I got that just about a year back, the day after some lunatic pulled into my parking lot in the middle of the night with a dead woman in his car and some crazy story about a wolf or something." There was a potent silence in which Harold realized the old guy wasn't playing. "You know what I think?" Gus said, and Harold couldn't help but listen. "With the moonlight in men's eyes, they can probably see just about any goddamn thing they want." Mandy didn't even wait until he was seated. "What the hell was going on in there?" she screamed. Harold strapped in and hit the ignition. The car howled into life, and he kicked it into gear, tearing into the gravel lot as he backed out and sped onto the road. "Just some crazy old shit telling dumb jokes," he said, as the mini-mart shrank behind them. "Well, you didn't have to stand there and listen, did you? You knew I was sitting out here in the damned heat, Harold." He opened the bag, extracted 2 beers, and passed one to her. He popped the cap on his bottle and heard Mandy sigh when she read the label. It was their beer. "You remembered," she said, surprised. "Yeah," Harold mumbled. He sucked a mouthful of the crisp brew and wiped the foam from his lips. "I remembered." He remembered well, taking her on the riverbed that night, in the sand, in the silvery glare of the moon. He remembered straining against her, feeling the sting of her fingernails on his back and shoulders, and the sweet, wet grip of her. He'd felt his howl rise and release as he lost himself in her, panting frantic declarations of love as their bodies rocked uncontrollably under the gaze of the mindless orb in the sky. "That shit's over." "What'd you say?" Mandy said. Harold shook his head, realizing he'd spoken his thoughts aloud. "I was just thinking about Phoenix, about staying at your sister's place and all. I'm glad that shit's over." He donned a convincing smile and sucked at his beer. "Things are going to be different in L.A., he said. Mandy nodded a quick agreement and pulled a long drink from her bottle. Harold grimaced in the dark, trying to recall the last time the sound of her voice had not made him want to run. Like he was running now, to Los Angeles this time, under the promise of a job at a body shop his cousin owned. She was supposed to have stayed with her sister. He was supposed to come for her after he'd saved a few months' rent. But she wasn't having none of that, she'd proclaimed with an accusing eye. They were married now, she'd explained, and married meant never being apart. Harold didn't need her to tell him what married meant. He knew well enough. It meant the shit was over, the parties and the good times. Hell, pretty much everything that made life worthwhile ended when he'd said those 2 stupid words. What the hell had he been thinking? He glanced at her face, lit momentarily by a passing truck. It was puffy now, pale since she had taken to spending so much time inside, sitting around in her bathrobe, watching her fucking stories on the damn television. The slight curl in the corner of her lips used to precede the lovey talk that newlyweds do. Now he only saw it when she was getting ready to bitch about some meaningless shit. "I want to go to Rodeo Drive when we get settled," she said, and turned to him. "He better pay you good because a girl can't live cheap in Los Angeles. Gotta look good, and that takes money, honey." Harold pretended to be contemplating the road. Your cousin's place anywhere near Beverly Hills? She said. He was about to respond. He was about to tell her that it didn't fucking matter how much money he made because he was sure she'd suck it up and spit it out like she had the rest of his life. He was about to explain just why he'd sought out the job in L.A. in the first place and how his heart had dropped when she'd insisted on coming along, how it had been a year since he had last given a damn about her, and why the only reason he hadn't divorced her is because he wasn't about to pay her any goddamn alimony. And that's when he saw the sign. Pocatello Canyon, Howard whispered. Mandy was lost in a verbal daydream about Rodeo Drive and Hollywood and how she had modeled some after high school. So she didn't register his words, but she did notice the way he slowed the car and turned off the freeway onto the little strip of dirt road that ran into the wild tangle of sage and darkness. I gotta piss, he explained when he knew she was about to ask. It wasn't really a lie. Something small scampered across the bumpy trail, casting a quick shadow in the headlights, and then vanished into the desert. Boy, you are jumpy, Mandy laughed when Harold's hands froze on the wheel. He slowed the car, let his head clear. What in the hell was he doing? This was crazy shit. Mandy sighed. If you're scared of a little old rabbit, you better think twice about living in L.A. Harold stepped on the gas, and the car rumbled into the void. Jesus, Harold, you don't need to drive to the middle of nowhere just to take a damn piss. Harold hit the brakes. He sat a moment, breathing, thinking. He looked at her. She looked back, her eyes puzzled, brows furrowed in some unspoken question. A slight curl was forming in the corner of her mouth. I'll be back in a sec, he said, and opened the door. Why the hell you gotta turn the lights off to take a piss, Harold? She yelled as he strode towards a dirt mound at the edge of the road. Beyond the mound, the desert reflected light in cold lunar hues. Vague shadows lay on the earth, seeming to move as he watched. Just wait, he yelled back. My precious jewel. His voice was shaking with something he could not control, something from a secret place inside where his heart dare not wander. He mounted the dirt hillock, shaking, not really believing he believed this. Of course he didn't believe bullshit like this. It was fucking insane. He barked a nervous laugh, unzipped and stood, waiting, he told himself, for the pressure inside to release and free him of this goddamn tension so he could be on his way, so he could get on with his life. His breath was as hot as the breeze that flowed from the belly of the desert, as ragged as the twisted plants that cast feral shadows against the haunted terrain. The moon stared down, a solitary eye, seeing all, casting no judgment. Then he heard the howl. What? She yelled from the car. What'd you say? Harold gripped himself to keep from pissing all over his boots. He was shaking uncontrollably now. He wanted to tell her that it was just some damn coyote, and that she should shut the fuck up for once, and it would all be over soon, and he could go on with his fucking life like it was before the creases had formed on his forehead, and the bags under his eyes, and the constant pain in his gut. Something moved across the desert, a flash of darkness that seemed to run over the ground like a... Harold turned and ran, screaming, Mandy! Mandy! His voice broke like a child, waking from a nightmare of monsters that dwell in the dark pits of the imagination. But this was real. It was too real. Mandy, lock your door! But Mandy wasn't there. Something was, though. Something was standing beside the car. It turned slowly to face him where he stood frozen in shock. It was as black as the night, its moist snout filled with razor teeth, dripping with the remains of some foul feast. Its torn and stinking fur was as gnarled as the growl that rumbled from the pit of its soul. Where is she? Harold screamed. The sound of his own voice broke his catharsis. Where is she, goddamn you? He was amazed to feel his fear falling away and his feet rushing him towards the demon. "Where's my jewel?" he howled as he felt his hands grip the thing's throat and felt the thing tearing back at him. "What did you do with her, you fucker?" he screamed and fell with it to the dirt, straining against it, against the sting of its claws across his back and face and shoulders, feeling the savage grip of the beast give way and his own howl build and release as he lost himself in the rage of losing her, screaming frantic declarations of vengeance as he rattled the beast uncontrollably under the gaze of the heartless orb in the sky. The thing was still, finally. Harold stood on shaking legs, panting and bleeding, and turned to the car, which was still rumbling a low idle in the night. "Mandy," he cried out. He walked slowly to the opened passenger door. "My jewel," he whispered. But she wasn't there. He backed away from the car and turned to gaze on the dead thing, the thing that had stolen his love and ripped the colors from his life. Harold screamed and turned to flee, but something moved ahead of him. He jumped back, fist raised to ward off the dark shape shifting in the shadows against the car. But he saw only a reflection in the glass, his reflection, peering wild-eyed and bloody in the silver glow, fist cocked and ready to strike. "You son of a bitch," he whispered, and fell to his knees. It had only been a trick of shadows in the night, a trick of the moonlight in his eyes. The Moonlight in Men's Eyes was written, read, and produced by Bryan Harrison. Thank you for listening.